The laughter started long before I even pulled my chair out to sit down at the massive dining table. It was that specific, booming, artificial kind of laughter that wealthy people use when they want everyone in the room to know they are having a wildly successful time. Vance, my wife's older brother, was holding court at the far end of the room. The dinner party was taking place at Vance's brand new house, a sprawling, obnoxious estate in a gated Dallas community where every lawn looks like a perfectly manicured golf course and the driveways are constantly filled with imported luxury cars. We were supposed to be celebrating his recent promotion. Earlier that week, Vance had been named the managing director of the family investment fund. It was a position he had acquired entirely through his bloodline rather than any actual competence. Vance had never built anything from the ground up in his entire life. He was a man born on third base who spent every waking hour trying to convince the world he had hit a triple. My wife, Olivia, sat to his immediate right. She looked absolutely stunning in a dark, tailored designer dress, holding a glass of impossibly expensive red wine. She was smiling at whatever Vance was saying, her eyes shining with that fierce, protective loyalty she always reserved exclusively for her side of the family. I walked over quietly and took the empty seat across from him. As soon as I sat down, I felt the atmosphere in the room shift slightly. It was not in an openly hostile way, but in the subtle, dismissive way a room changes when the hired help walks in to clear the plates. I was the husband, but in this specific social circle I was just the background noise. I was the guy who came with the package. Vance took a long, arrogant sip of his drink and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the imported mahogany table. He had that smug smirk on his face, the exact one he always wore when he was about to put on a show for his business partners. The table was completely full of them. Real estate developers, corporate lawyers, private equity managers, and a few local politicians. These were people who measured a man's worth strictly by the balance in his offshore checking account and the brand of watch on his wrist. "So, Michael," Vance said loudly, projecting his voice to make sure the entire table stopped their side conversations and looked at us. "I meant to ask you something earlier before the caterers brought out the steaks." I looked up from my empty plate. I kept my expression completely neutral. "What is it, Vance?" He grinned, looking left and right around the table to gather his audience. "We are setting up a new satellite office for the fund next month. We are expanding the operation downtown. We are going to need someone to run the networking cables, set up the basic routers, maybe plug in the printers and make sure the coffee machine is connected to the network. You know, basic grunt stuff. Tell me, can you even fix Wi-Fi? Because we are looking for a computer guy to run errands, and I thought I should probably keep it in the family to help you out." The table erupted. Several of the corporate lawyers chuckled deeply into their linen napkins. A major real estate developer sitting across from me shook his head and laughed out loud, slapping his hand on the table. It was a joke entirely designed to put me in my place. It was calculated. It was meant to remind everyone present that while Vance was handling tens of millions in corporate assets, I was just the guy who stayed home and messed around with keyboards. I did not look at Vance right away. I looked directly at Olivia. We had been married for 10 years. For one brief, desperate second, I waited for her to step in. I waited for her to defend her husband. I waited for her to say, "Actually, Michael is a highly specialized independent contractor. Actually, Michael has a demanding career. Actually, Vance, that is incredibly disrespectful and not funny at all." Instead, Olivia laughed. She laughed right along with them. It was a soft, musical sound that cut right through my chest like a razor blade. She took a delicate sip of her wine and rolled her eyes, shaking her head as if my very existence was a slightly embarrassing burden she bravely had to tolerate every single day. That was the exact moment the illusion of my marriage shattered. The pain did not hit me. There was no sudden wave of sadness or heartbreak. There was only a cold, sharp, terrifying clarity. I leaned back in my chair. The dining room was filled with the rich smell of roasted meat and expensive perfume. The crystal glasses caught the warm light from the massive chandelier above us. Everyone was still chuckling, waiting for me to turn red, waiting for me to lower my head, mumble an excuse, and take the punch like a good, quiet, obedient husband. They truly thought I was a harmless target. They thought I was exactly what Olivia had repeatedly told them I was over the years. A low-level IT technician who could barely pay his own bills and lived entirely off his wife's success. I looked directly into Vance's eyes. I kept my face completely blank. I did not frown. I did not smile. I did not show a single ounce of emotion. I just let the silence stretch out. I let it hang in the air for 3 full seconds until the laughter began to awkwardly die down, replaced by a slight, uncomfortable tension. "Well?" Vance pressed, swirling the ice in his scotch glass, trying to maintain his dominance. "Can you do it or not?" I placed my hands flat on the cold mahogany table. "I can," I said quietly. My voice was calm, steady, and completely devoid of anger. It carried easily across the sudden, heavy silence of the dining room. "Only if it is easier than tracing $50 million in laundered offshore funds." The timing was absolute perfection. A few people let out a delayed, awkward chuckle, assuming I was making a sarcastic, highly defensive, self-deprecating joke to save face. Vance rolled his eyes heavily, clearly annoyed that I had tried to be clever instead of just taking the insult quietly. Olivia sighed softly, the exact kind of tired sigh a mother gives a toddler who is misbehaving in a grocery store. But not everyone was laughing. Sitting exactly 3 seats down from Vance was an older man. He had silver hair, sharp, predatory eyes, and the kind of rigid posture that made him look like he was forged out of solid iron. He was not a real estate developer. He was a guest of one of the major investors, brought along quietly as a +1. He had been completely silent all evening, sipping his bourbon and watching the room with a look of mild, detached boredom. When I spoke, the older man froze. His heavy crystal bourbon glass stopped halfway to his mouth. His eyes narrowed instantly, snapping directly toward me with laser precision. He looked past the expensive tailored suit I was wearing. He looked right through the quiet husband facade. It was the look of instant, absolute, undeniable recognition. I felt my heart beat once very hard against my ribs, because I recognized him, too. The conversation around the table started to pick up again as people tried to move past the awkward moment. Someone asked Vance about his golf swing. Someone else loudly mentioned the volatility of the stock market. Nobody noticed the older man setting his glass down on the table with a firm, deliberate thud that rattled the silverware. He leaned slightly forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Excuse me," he said. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a strange, commanding weight that forced the room to listen. The table quieted down almost instantly. Vance looked over, his host's smile faltering slightly. "Everything all right, Arthur?" Arthur did not look at Vance. He kept his sharp eyes locked entirely on me. "Agent Shadow," he said. Every single sound in the room seemed to evaporate into thin air. The low hum of the central air conditioning suddenly felt incredibly loud. My breath caught in my throat. Nobody had called me that name in 5 long years. It was not a nickname. It was not a joke. It was an internal federal designation used only by the highest levels of cyber intelligence. I glanced at Olivia. She looked completely confused, her brow furrowed. Vance looked irritated. The rest of the table just stared in blank silence. "I am sorry, Arthur," Vance said, forcing a loud, patronizing laugh. "I think you have him confused with someone else. This is Michael. He is my brother-in-law. He is just a computer guy who works from our basement." Arthur finally shifted his intense gaze to Vance. The look he gave him was so full of utter pity and cold disdain that Vance actually physically leaned back in his chair, intimidated without knowing why. Then Arthur looked calmly back at me. "I did not realize you were operating in the private sector," Arthur said, his voice entirely serious. "I retired," I said, keeping my tone even. "A few years ago." Arthur nodded slowly, absorbing the information. "I see. The Bureau still uses your forensic framework, you know, that tracking algorithm you built from scratch for the Miami cartel bust back in 2019. Nobody in the department has been able to improve on it. They still teach your packet-sniffing protocols at Quantico. The silence in the room was now thick enough to cut with a steak knife. Vance's mouth was hanging slightly open. Olivia was staring at me as if I had suddenly taken off a mask and revealed a completely different face. A corporate lawyer sitting near the end of the table dropped his silver fork onto his ceramic plate with a loud, ringing clatter. Arthur picked up his bourbon, took a slow, deliberate sip, and leaned back in his chair, looking around the table of stunned millionaires. "A computer guy," he muttered, shaking his head with a humorless smile. He did not say another word for the rest of the meal. He did not need to. The damage was completely, irreversibly done. The air had been entirely sucked out of Vance's arrogant victory lap. The rest of the dinner was agonizingly uncomfortable for them, and quietly fascinating for me. People kept stealing nervous glances in my direction. Vance tried twice to aggressively steer the conversation back to his promotion and his brilliance, but his voice completely lacked its usual arrogant punch. Olivia refused to make eye contact with me for the next hour. She stared down at her plate, her jaw tight, her knuckles white as she gripped her wine glass. I sat there, cutting my steak and eating in perfect silence. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel vindicated. I felt an entirely different sensation creeping into my bones. I felt the cold realization that the people I called family had absolutely no idea who I really was, and more importantly, they had never once cared to find out. By the time the agonizing party finally ended, the sky had completely opened up. A heavy, relentless Texas rainstorm was pouring down on the estate, turning the immaculate lawns into muddy swamps. The valet attendants were running frantically back and forth under large black umbrellas, pulling luxury cars up to the massive stone front portico. Olivia and I stood near the towering double doors, waiting for our SUV to be brought around. She had not spoken a single word to me since we left the dining table. "Are you going to explain what just happened in there?" she finally hissed, keeping her voice low and furious so the other departing guests standing nearby would not hear. "Explain what?" I asked calmly, looking out at the driving rain. "That old man," she snapped, her eyes flashing with anger. "Arthur, what on earth was he talking about? You embarrassed Vance in front of his biggest clients. You sat there and let that man make it sound like you were some kind of secret agent hacker. It was completely humiliating for our family." I turned slowly to look at her. I truly looked at her. I saw the deep anger in her eyes, the sheer, blinding indignation that I had dared to pull focus away from her brother on his special night. "I just answered his question, Olivia. I did not invite him to speak." Before she could launch into another whispered tirade, I heard the heavy sound of footsteps behind us on the marble floor. "Michael!" I turned around. Arthur was standing there, buttoning his dark trench coat. The valet had just pulled his black, unmarked federal sedan up to the curb. Arthur stepped closer, stopping just out of earshot of Olivia, who was glaring at him. He looked at me with those sharp, calculating eyes that had seen decades of financial ruin. "It is good to see you, son," Arthur said quietly. "Good to see you too, sir," I replied. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a simple, thick white business card. He handed it to me with a subtle movement. "I know you are out of the game. I know you walked away, but something came across my desk recently. I think you need to see it immediately." I took the card, feeling the heavy cardstock. "What is it?" Arthur stepped closer, invading my personal space so his voice would be masked by the sound of the rain. His voice dropped to a barely audible, urgent whisper. "Data leak. Project Orion. Someone inside your personal network is using your old credentials. They are moving things around, Michael. Big things. Check your back doors tonight." He gave me a firm, singular nod, turned his collar up, and walked out into the pouring rain. The valet quickly opened the back door of the sedan, and Arthur disappeared into the dark interior. The car pulled away instantly, its red taillights bleeding into the wet, black darkness of the night. I stood there on the porch, the cold wind blowing the rain in and misting my face. I looked down at the card in my hand. It just had his name and a direct 10-digit phone number. Nothing else. But it was his words that were ringing in my ears like a fire alarm. Project Orion. My credentials. My network. Our SUV finally pulled up. Olivia marched out to the passenger side, holding her expensive designer purse over her head to shield her hair from the rain. I walked to the driver's seat and got in. The heavy, insulated doors closed, instantly shutting out the chaotic noise of the storm. The interior of the car smelled heavily of expensive leather and Olivia's floral perfume. I did not reach for the ignition button right away. Instead, I pulled my phone out of my jacket pocket. "What are you doing?" Olivia demanded, shivering slightly. "Start the car. I want to go home right now." I completely ignored her. My fingers flew rapidly across the glass screen. I bypassed the standard interface and opened a hidden application, a highly secure, custom-built terminal emulator that I used to quietly monitor my private servers at home. I typed in a complex, 30-character command line. The screen went pitch black, then instantly filled with cascading rows of bright green text. I had set up a silent alarm on our home network years ago. A digital tripwire. It was just a basic security measure to ensure nobody was accessing my old, encrypted federal case files. I had not needed to check it in months. I thought I was safe. The command screen finished loading the query. There were over 400 unauthorized access logs. Someone had systematically bypassed the outer firewall of our home network. Someone had successfully logged into my secure partition using my master administrative keys. But they had not gone after my old government case files. Instead, they had used my server as a proxy to route massive, heavily encrypted data packets to an untraceable offshore IP address. I checked the exact timestamp of the absolute last data transfer. It happened exactly 2 hours and 15 minutes ago, right when Vance was pouring drinks, laughing, and making jokes about me fixing Wi-Fi. "Michael?" Olivia snapped sharply, her voice rising in extreme irritation. "Drive the damn car." I looked closely at the screen. I looked at the routing numbers. I recognized the specific financial protocol being used. It was a dark web banking bridge, a system used exclusively for moving massive sums of illicit capital invisibly across borders. Someone was using my name, my equipment, and my digital fingerprints to commit federal wire fraud. And they were doing it from inside the walls of my own house. I slowly put the phone back into my pocket. I pushed the ignition button, put the car in gear, and drove out into the violent storm. I did not say a single word the entire way home. The man who had walked into that party was a loyal, tired husband. The man driving home was a ghost preparing for war. To truly understand how my life had quietly transformed into a massive, active federal crime scene, you have to understand the slow, agonizing decay of the last 10 years. Olivia and I met when we were both in our late 20s. Back then, she was driven, incredibly sharp, and fiercely independent. She worked in corporate public relations, grinding out brutal 60-hour work weeks just to prove herself to her family. I was a senior forensic analyst for the federal government, spending my days tracking sophisticated cyber syndicates across the globe. We were a real team. We respected each other's intellect and drive. But things change. Money changes people in ways that are quiet, insidious, and deeply destructive. 5 years ago, Olivia's father passed away unexpectedly from a massive heart attack. He left behind a sprawling corporate empire and an absolutely massive financial inheritance. Olivia and her brother, Vance, immediately stepped into total control of the family trust. Overnight, our entire lives shifted on its axis. We moved from a comfortable, modest suburban house into a sprawling, multi-million-dollar property up in the hills. The cars in the garage got faster and louder. The clothes in the closets got exponentially more expensive. The people we spent our weekend time with stopped being actual friends and started being strategic contacts. Olivia was appointed as the chief executive officer of the family's primary investment arm. The pressure on her from the board and the shareholders was immense. She was constantly traveling across the country, constantly putting out corporate fires, constantly dealing with cutthroat, older board members who wanted to see her fail. I made a choice I genuinely thought was the right one for our marriage. I resigned from my high-level position at the Bureau. The constant travel, the late nights, and the high-stakes danger of my federal job was putting entirely too much strain on our relationship. I decided to step back so she could shine. I told Olivia I would do freelance cybersecurity consulting from home. It would give me the flexibility to manage the massive household, oversee the endless estate renovations, and support her completely as she built her empire. I even quietly took over the entire digital infrastructure of her company, quietly securing their vulnerable networks, setting up deeply encrypted communications, and making sure her proprietary data was completely safe from corporate espionage. I did it all for free out of pure love and loyalty. I thought I was being a modern, supportive husband. I thought we were a partnership building a life together. I was completely, utterly wrong. When you voluntarily stop earning the lion's share of the money in a relationship that is fundamentally driven by wealth and status, you slowly lose your seat at the table. It did not happen all at once. It was not a sudden explosion of disrespect. It was a slow, daily drip of poison. First, it was the social events and the galas. Olivia would introduce me to her new, incredibly wealthy peers not as a retired federal investigator or a cybersecurity expert, but simply as her husband who worked on computers at home. I let it slide. I did not need the massive ego boost. I knew what I had accomplished in my life. I did not need the validation of strangers. Then, it was the decision-making process within our own home. Small things at first. Buying a brand new luxury car without asking my opinion. Booking extravagant international vacations without even checking my schedule. Eventually, the disrespect bled directly into the big things. She and Vance would make massive, life-altering financial decisions regarding our joint assets, and I would only find out about it when I accidentally saw the paperwork sitting on the kitchen counter. I became part of the furniture. I was the reliable, quiet, invisible guy who made sure the complex smart home system worked flawlessly, who kept the servers running without a hitch, who nodded politely at endless dinner parties while Vance talked loudly about his genius business strategies. I absorbed the constant passive-aggressive comments from her family. I absorbed the jokes about being a kept man. I told myself it was just the immense stress of her job talking. I told myself that marriage was inherently about sacrifice and compromise. I had willingly given up my career, my federal badge, and my daily purpose to build an impenetrable fortress around her. I had traded everything to be her safety net. And in return, she had slowly, systematically stripped away every ounce of my dignity. I sat alone in the darkness of our massive living room that night, listening to the heavy rain continue to beat against the floor-to-ceiling windows, feeling the suffocating weight of the last 5 years crashing down on my shoulders. I pulled out my laptop and placed it gently on the glass coffee table. I did not turn on the overhead lights. The cool blue glow of the high-resolution screen illuminated my hands. I opened the terminal again. I started tracing the data packets. I needed to know exactly how deep the infection went. I needed to know exactly what they had done in my name. I sat there for 6 straight hours, typing line after line of complex code, slicing effortlessly through the firewalls I had built, following the digital breadcrumbs they foolishly thought they had hidden from me. What I found was not just a simple financial mistake. It was an architecture of absolute, calculated betrayal. The next morning, the massive house was eerily quiet. The violent storm had finally passed, leaving behind a dull, oppressive gray sky that perfectly matched my mood. I sat at the sprawling marble kitchen island, drinking a cup of strong black coffee. My laptop was closed. The devastating financial data I had extracted overnight was securely stored on a highly encrypted, biometric external drive, hidden deep inside my jacket pocket. Olivia walked into the kitchen wearing a flowing silk robe. She looked incredibly tired, rubbing her temples aggressively as she headed straight for the expensive espresso machine. She did not look at me. She did not say good morning. She just started making her coffee, her movements sharp, rigid, and deeply irritated. "I have a massive board meeting at noon," she said to the wall, waiting for the machine to finish. "Vance is coming over beforehand to go over the quarterly numbers. I need you to stay out of the way today. Do not come into the home office." I took a slow sip of my coffee. "All right." She turned around, holding her delicate ceramic cup. She finally looked at me, and her expression was a toxic mix of physical exhaustion and lingering, intense anger from the night before. "I am absolutely serious, Michael. What you did at the dinner party last night was completely unacceptable. You made Vance look like a total fool in front of our key investors." "Vance made himself look like a fool, Olivia. He asked me in front of 30 people if I could fix his office Wi-Fi." "He was joking," she snapped, her voice echoing sharply in the large, empty kitchen. "It is how men in business banter. You are always so incredibly sensitive about everything. You sit at home all day in your sweatpants, playing with your little servers, and you completely lack the basic social grace to handle high-level networking events. You have absolutely no idea the kind of intense pressure we are under to perform." I looked at her. I really looked at the woman I had sworn to protect with my life. She truly believed her own fabricated narrative. She had told the lie so many times, to so many people, that it had become her absolute, unshakable reality. In her mind, she was the brilliant, tragic, overworked titan of industry, carrying the massive weight of the world and her family's legacy on her shoulders. And I was the lazy, useless, incredibly sensitive dependent she generously allowed to live in her beautiful house. She had completely erased the capable man I used to be. She had willfully erased the federal agent who had dismantled international crime rings. She had erased the man who used to stay awake for 3 days straight, fueled entirely by adrenaline and bad coffee, analyzing encrypted ledgers to put cartel bosses in federal prison. She had buried that man deep underground because a strong, highly capable husband did not fit the narrative she desperately needed. She needed to be the absolute savior of the family. She needed me to be weak and dependent so she could feel incredibly powerful. "I understand," I said softly, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Good," she sighed heavily, turning her back to me and looking at her phone. "Just make sure the guest bathroom downstairs is fully stocked with fresh towels. And go fix the printer in the study. Vance needs to print out some massive contracts, and it was jamming yesterday." She walked out of the kitchen without another word, her silk robe trailing behind her. I sat there, staring at the empty space where she had been standing. I felt a strange, profound sense of calm wash over my entire body. It was the calm of a man who suddenly realizes he is no longer hopelessly trapped in a dark maze. The lights had been turned on. He has finally seen the map, and he knows exactly where the exit is. Vance arrived exactly an hour later. I heard his obnoxiously loud sports car roar into the circular driveway. He walked into the house like he owned the entire property, carrying a heavy leather briefcase and loudly shouting for Olivia. I stayed in the kitchen, slowly washing my coffee cup in the sink. He walked past the open doorway, paused, glanced at me, and offered a tight, incredibly sarcastic little salute. "Morning, IT department," he smirked, his eyes full of condescension. "Morning, Vance," I replied evenly, not breaking my rhythm. He disappeared down the long hallway and went into the home office with Olivia. I heard the heavy, solid oak doors close shut and the lock click loudly into place. I wiped my wet hands on a clean towel. I did not go to the guest bathroom to check the towels. I did not go to fix the jammed printer. Instead, I walked down the opposite hallway toward my private study, the room where I kept my personal servers, the room that was my absolute sanctuary in this massive, incredibly empty house. I reached out and opened the door, and the cold, calculated calm I had been holding on to instantly vanished. My study was completely gone. I stood completely frozen in the doorway, my hand gripped tightly on the cold brass doorknob. The room had been aggressively, unapologetically stripped bare. My heavy, antique oak desk was violently shoved into a dark corner, the wood deeply scratched. My massive server racks, the absolute lifeblood of my private network, had been brutally unplugged and pushed carelessly against the far wall, leaving a tangled, dangerous mess of expensive cables spilling wildly across the pristine hardwood floor. In the exact center of the room, completely dominating the space, stood two massive, newly installed custom-built wine refrigerators. I walked slowly into the room. My chest felt incredibly tight, as if a heavy weight had been placed directly on my lungs. My breathing grew shallow and rapid. I looked around, my eyes scanning the utter destruction of my only safe space. The tall, built-in bookshelves that once neatly held my technical manuals, my federal case studies, and my extensive personal library were completely empty. I turned my head toward the corner. There was a large, heavy-duty black plastic trash bag sitting carelessly next to the ruined desk. I walked over to it, my boots making no sound on the floor. I opened the top of the bag. Inside were my personal things, not just cheap office supplies or old pens. My framed, signed commendations from the director of the FBI. My old, incredibly hard-earned federal badges. And at the absolute bottom of the heavy bag, buried carelessly under a pile of discarded power cables and old paperwork, was a small, reinforced metal lockbox. I reached in and pulled it out. My hands were visibly shaking. The heavy metal lockbox was deeply dented on one side, as if it had been dropped heavily on the hardwood floor by someone who did not care what was inside. I fumbled with the latch and opened it. Inside were 3 highly specialized external hard drives. They contained the digitized, unrecoverable home videos and photographs of my late father. It was the only copy in existence in the entire world. Alongside them lay his carefully preserved military service medals. The thick glass casing that held his Purple Heart had been completely shattered. Sharp, jagged shards of glass were scattered all across the digital drives, deeply scratching the protective casing. I knelt slowly on the floor, holding the broken wooden frame in my hands. I did not yell. I did not throw anything against the wall. I just stared at the broken glass, feeling a profound, bottomless emptiness opening up inside my chest. I heard the sharp clicking of heels behind me. I turned my head. Olivia was standing in the doorway holding a thick manila folder. She looked at the ruined room, then down at me kneeling on the floor, and sighed loudly, an aggressive sound of pure impatience. "I explicitly told you I was having the new wine coolers delivered today," she said, tapping her expensive pen against the folder. "Vance desperately needs a climate-controlled space for his vintage collection. He is hosting a massive tasting event next month for the investors. You barely even used this room anyway." I stood up slowly. I held the shattered, ruined frame tightly in my hand. I looked at her. "You threw my father's military medals in a trash bag." Olivia aggressively crossed her arms over her chest. "Oh, please do not be so incredibly dramatic, Michael. The professional cleaners packed your things up. I told them to put everything in a bag so it would not get covered in construction dust during the installation. Just put the little drives in a drawer somewhere. It is just old junk anyway. You can easily buy a new frame online." "It is not junk, Olivia. It is my father's entire legacy." "And this massive house is my legacy," she snapped viciously, her thin patience instantly and completely vanishing. "I pay the massive mortgage. I pay the astronomical property taxes. I pay the massive electricity bill that runs those stupid, loud servers of yours. Vance is bringing tens of millions of dollars into the fund right now, and he needs a proper place to store his assets. You need to stop being so incredibly selfish and start contributing something to this family." I looked at the woman standing a few feet in front of me. I looked at the raw hostility burning in her eyes, the utter, chilling lack of empathy, the absolute, unwavering conviction that her immense wealth gave her the divine right to destroy the things I loved. Something fundamental broke inside me in that exact second. Not my heart. My heart had been slowly fracturing for 5 years. What broke was the invisible chain, the lingering obligation, the heavy guilt, the desperate, pathetic lingering hope that maybe, deep down, She still loved the man she married. It was entirely gone, evaporated into thin air. The man who loved her died right there, standing silently on the hardwood floor of a ruined study. I carefully placed the broken frame on the scratched desk. I picked up the metal lockbox and tucked it securely under my arm. I looked directly at Olivia. My face was a mask of cold, unbreakable stone. "You are absolutely right," I said. My voice was chillingly soft, devoid of any human warmth. "It is your house." I walked right past her. I did not look back. I did not slam the heavy door. I walked straight out of the house, out to my car, put the lockbox carefully on the passenger seat, and drove away. I did not know where I was going. I just drove. I drove down the winding hills until the burning anger finally burned itself out, leaving absolutely nothing but cold, terrifyingly calculating logic. I pulled the car into a deserted parking lot overlooking the massive highway. I took out my encrypted phone. I carefully dialed the direct 10-digit line on the business card Arthur had given me. He answered on the very first ring. "Shadow, I need a highly secure facility," I said, staring out at the traffic. "And I need immediate, unrestricted access to the federal financial tracing network." "Done," Arthur said without a single second of hesitation. "Welcome back." I finally returned to the massive house late that evening. The bright lights were on in the sprawling living room. Vance's obnoxious sports car was thankfully gone from the driveway. Olivia was sitting alone on the expensive leather sofa, drinking a large glass of red wine and scrolling rapidly through her tablet. She did not even bother to look up when I walked through the front door. She was executing a classic, textbook manipulation tactic. The silent treatment. She was actively punishing me for walking out earlier, waiting for me to break the silence, to apologize, to grovel, and to finally accept my pathetic place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. I walked slowly into the kitchen and poured myself a tall glass of ice water. I leaned back against the cool marble counter and just watched her for a moment. "Are you finally done throwing your little emotional tantrum?" she asked loudly, still not taking her eyes off the glowing screen. I took a slow sip of cold water. "I want to talk about our joint finances, Olivia." She finally looked up, freezing in place. Her eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. "Excuse me? What did you just say?" "Our finances," I repeated calmly, my voice perfectly steady. "I want to see the official accounting books for the family trust. I want to see the federal tax filings for the last 3 years. And I want to see the detailed capital flow reports for Vance's new expansion project downtown." Olivia let out a sharp, incredibly loud, mocking laugh. She practically threw her tablet down onto the glass coffee table. "Are you completely out of your mind? You want to look at the corporate books? What on earth are you going to do, Michael? Defrag the accounting software? Restart the router? You don't know the first thing about high-level corporate finance. We are legally married. It is joint property under state law. I have a fundamental legal right to see exactly where the money is going." She stood up abruptly. The sheer condescension radiating from her was almost a physical force in the room. She walked aggressively over to the kitchen island and slammed her hands down hard on the marble countertop. "Let me make something perfectly, crystal clear to you right now," she said, her voice dripping with absolute venom. "You do not have rights to anything in this house. You are a parasite. You sit in this massive house that I bought with my money, eating the expensive food that I pay for, using the high-speed internet that I provide. Vance and I are out there working brutal 14-hour days, bleeding for this company, while you play video games and complain about old medals." This was it. Cognitive dissonance in its purest, most toxic form. I had seen the data. She had actively stolen my digital credentials. She was using my specific name to launder massive amounts of money offshore. She was actively exposing me to decades in federal prison if the authorities ever caught on. Yet, in her deeply twisted mind, she was the ultimate victim. She was the martyr bleeding for the family company, and I was the incredibly ungrateful parasite trying to steal her glory. "You actually think you deserve to see the books?" she continued, her voice rising to a frantic shout, echoing off the high ceilings. You have not brought a single dollar into this house in 5 years. You are absolutely nothing without me, Michael. Nothing. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match hers. I just stood there and absorbed her words. Every single insult, every vicious lie, every scream was just data to me now. It was absolute final confirmation that I was doing the right thing. There was nothing left to save here. I see, I said quietly. You don't see anything, she spat furiously, grabbing her wine glass. If you ever bring this up again, I swear to God, I will cut off all your credit cards and throw you out on the street. Now go fix the damn printer. Vance desperately needs it tomorrow morning. She grabbed her wine bottle and stormed up the wide staircase. I listened to the sharp sound of her footsteps echo down the long hallway. I heard the master bedroom door slam shut with incredible force. I finished my glass of water in silence. I washed the glass meticulously in the sink, dried it carefully with a towel, and put it away in its exact place in the cabinet. Everything in the kitchen was perfectly neat. Everything was perfectly orderly. I pulled my heavily encrypted phone out of my jacket pocket. The screen illuminated the dark kitchen. I opened the secure messaging app and sent a single, short text message to Arthur. I am going in, setting up the war room tomorrow morning. I put the phone away and walked slowly toward the basement door. Olivia truly thought she held all the power in the world because she physically controlled the bank accounts and the real estate. She did not understand the modern world at all. Money was no longer paper in a vault. Money was just invisible numbers on a glowing screen. And absolutely nobody in the world controlled the numbers better than I did. The execution had officially begun. The federal secure facility was located in an unmarked, heavily reinforced concrete building situated on the industrial outskirts of the city. There were no signs, no corporate logos, and absolutely no windows on the ground floor. It looked like a forgotten warehouse. But inside it was a state-of-the-art digital fortress. I arrived at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning. The air inside the server room was aggressively cold, kept at a constant temperature to prevent the massive banks of supercomputers from overheating. The low, steady hum of the cooling fans sounded like the engine of a massive ship. It was a sound I had sorely missed. It was the sound of truth. Arthur was waiting for me in the main observation room. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not offer any meaningless platitudes about my marriage. He simply pointed to a heavy steel desk in the corner. On top of it sat a high-end, military-grade workstation with 3 massive, high-resolution monitors. It was already booted up and connected directly to the Federal Financial Tracing Network, bypassing all civilian internet protocols. I sat down in the heavy leather chair. I placed my encrypted external hard drive on the desk. I plugged it into the secure terminal and entered my 32-character biometric passphrase. The screens flickered, and my custom forensic operating system loaded instantly. I took a deep breath of the recycled, freezing air. The quiet, compliant husband who fixed printers and restocked guest bathrooms was gone. The apex predator of the digital world had returned to his natural habitat. I began by casting a wide, invisible net over the entire digital infrastructure of Olivia and Vance's investment firm. I did not use a brute force attack. I did not try to smash through their corporate firewalls. That is what amateurs do. Instead, I used a sophisticated technique known as passive packet sniffing. I simply sat quietly in the dark corners of their network and watched the data flow back and forth. I was looking for anomalies. I was looking for the shadows. It did not take long. Vance and Olivia were incredibly arrogant, which meant they were incredibly sloppy. They believed that because they were moving millions of dollars, the sheer volume of their transactions would hide the dirty money. But money always leaves a footprint. I isolated the specific IP addresses that had hijacked my credentials the night before. I ran a recursive tracing algorithm, following the digital breadcrumbs backward through the maze of dummy servers they had set up. I watched the green lines of code cascade down my center monitor, untangling the complex web of lies they had built over the last 3 years. They had used my name, my old federal clearance codes, and my digital signature to bypass the standard banking regulations. They had turned me into their ultimate scapegoat. If the federal authorities ever audited the firm, the digital paper trail would lead directly to my home office. It would look exactly like a rogue IT contractor embezzling funds. It was a brilliant, incredibly evil plan. But they made one fatal miscalculation. They forgot who built the system they were trying to abuse. By noon, my eyes were burning from staring at the bright monitors, but I could not stop. The sheer scale of their operation was staggering. I started cross-referencing the corporate tax filings with the hidden offshore ledgers I had unearthed. I was looking for the source of the funds. Where exactly was Vance getting the $50 million he was so casually moving through my hijacked servers? The answer made my blood run completely cold. I cracked open the encrypted client database of their primary investment fund. I bypassed the two-factor authentication by mirroring the security tokens used by Olivia's personal assistant. Once I was inside, I started matching the outbound offshore wire transfers to the internal client accounts. They were not just dodging corporate taxes. They were outright stealing. Specifically, they were draining the inheritance trusts of their oldest, most vulnerable clients. These were massive, generation-spanning trust funds set up by wealthy families to provide for their grandchildren or to fund charitable foundations. Vance and Olivia were systematically skimming massive percentages off the top of these inheritance accounts. They would generate fake, highly complex loss reports, blaming the missing capital on unexpected market volatility and poor real estate investments. But the money was never lost in the market. It was being quietly siphoned out, converted into untraceable cryptocurrency, and routed through 3 different shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. And they were using the profits to fund their extravagant lifestyle. The massive estate Olivia and I lived in. The obnoxious sports cars Vance drove. The incredibly expensive designer dresses Olivia wore to her high society galas. It was all paid for with stolen inheritance money. They were absolute parasites, feeding on the legacies of dead people to finance their own delusions of grandeur. I pulled up the specific documentation for Vance's recent promotion. The board of directors had elevated him to managing director based on the incredibly high returns he was supposedly generating for the firm. But the returns were completely fabricated. He was using the stolen inheritance money to artificially inflate the quarterly earnings reports of his own division. He had literally stolen his way into a promotion. And Olivia, the brilliant chief executive officer, the woman who constantly berated me for not contributing to the family, was fully complicit. She was actively signing off on the fake loss reports. She was the architect of the entire cover-up. I sat back in my chair, rubbing my tired eyes. I felt a profound sense of disgust. For 10 years, I had believed I was married to a fiercely independent, highly ethical businesswoman. I had sacrificed my own career to support her vision. But she had no vision. She was just a common thief in an expensive suit. I pressed a button on the keyboard and began downloading the entire database. Every single altered ledger. Every fake loss report. Every offshore wire transfer. I was pulling the entire foundation of their empire out from under them. I needed the final nail in the coffin. Following the money was enough to get them indicted by the federal government, but defense attorneys can drag financial cases out for years. They can argue about accounting errors, misplaced decimals, and rogue employees. I needed absolute, irrefutable proof of malicious intent. I needed to prove, without a shadow of a doubt, that Olivia and Vance knew exactly what they were doing, and that they had actively conspired to frame me. I shifted my focus away from the financial ledgers and targeted their internal corporate communications. I breached the primary email server of the investment firm. I did not just look at their current inbox. People who commit massive corporate fraud usually delete their incriminating emails, thinking that clicking the trash can icon makes the evidence disappear forever. But data never truly dies. It just gets reallocated. I ran a deep-level data recovery script on the server's master hard drives. It took 2 hours for the progress bar to slowly inch its way to 100%. When it finally finished, I had access to every single email, text message, an encrypted chat they had sent or received over the last 5 years, including the ones they had desperately tried to permanently delete. I set up a keyword filter searching for my own name, along with terms like federal audit, offshore, and liability. The screen instantly populated with dozens of internal messages between Vance and Olivia. I started reading through them. My jaw tightened. The sheer casual cruelty of their conversations was breathtaking. They talked about me the same way a farmer talks about a piece of broken machinery. But one specific email chain stood out. It was dated 6 months ago, right around the time they had started moving the stolen inheritance money into the Cyprus accounts. Vance had sent an email to Olivia, expressing a rare moment of panic. He wrote that the federal regulators were asking questions about a sudden drop in a major trust account. He was terrified of an audit. Olivia's response was timestamped 3 minutes later. I read the words on the glowing screen, and any remaining shred of humanity I felt for my wife completely evaporated. She wrote, "Stop panicking like a child. The regulators will not find anything. I have already routed all the outbound transfers through Michael's home server. I used his administrative keys to authorize the security protocols. I left his digital signature on all the shell company registration forms. If the feds come knocking, they will see an isolated cyber breach. They will think he is a rogue hacker who got greedy. He sits in the basement all day anyway. Nobody will question it. Keep moving the funds. If it all goes to hell, that idiot takes the fall, not us." I stared at the screen for a long time. There it was, the absolute bottom of the abyss, the Achilles heel of their entire defense. She had not just stolen my identity. She had actively, maliciously planned to send her own husband to federal prison for decades just to protect her brother's stolen money. I highlighted the entire email chain, verified the digital encryption hash to prove it had not been tampered with, and saved it to the master file. The trap was now fully loaded. I spent the next 3 days practically living in the secure facility. I drank countless cups of terrible black coffee and ate stale vending machine sandwiches. I did not go home. I ignored Olivia's annoyed text messages demanding to know where I was and why the smart home thermostat was not working correctly. I was completely focused on the task at hand. By Friday evening, I had finished compiling the data. I had built a massive, comprehensive digital dossier. It was over 500 pages of highly encrypted, mathematically verified evidence. It contained every single wire transfer, every fake loss report, every offshore bank account number, and the entire devastating email chain where Olivia admitted to framing me. I organized the data into a clean, easy-to-read chronological timeline. I made it so simple that a first-year law student could secure a conviction with it. I finalized the encryption sequence and pulled the external drive from the terminal. The metal casing was warm to the touch, felt incredibly heavy in my hand, like a loaded weapon. I walked out of the server room and went down the hall to Arthur's office. The door was open. He was sitting behind his desk, reviewing a stack of physical files. He looked up as I walked in. He saw the expression on my face and immediately closed the folder he was reading. I walked over to his desk and placed the external drive gently on the polished wood. "Is it done?" Arthur asked quietly. "It is all there," I said. My voice sounded rough and used. $50 million in stolen inheritance funds, wire fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to commit federal perjury. They are using my digital credentials to run a massive money laundering operation through Cyprus. Arthur did not look surprised. He just looked sad. He picked up the drive and turned it over in his hands. "Your wife. She is the primary architect of the cover-up?" I confirmed, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Her brother is the one moving the money. She is the one hiding the bodies." Arthur nodded slowly. He opened his top drawer and placed the drive inside, locking it with a heavy brass key. "I will have my top forensic accountants verify the hashtags and the routing numbers. It will take them the weekend to process a file this large and get the federal warrant signed by a judge. We will move on Monday." "No," I said firmly. "Not Monday." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "When?" "Next Thursday," I said. Olivia's investment firm is hosting their annual charity gala and shareholder appreciation dinner at the downtown convention center. The entire board of directors will be there. Every major investor will be there. The local press is covering the event. Vance is giving a keynote speech on corporate transparency and ethics. That is when you move. Arthur studied my face for a long moment. He saw the cold, absolute certainty in my eyes. He knew I was not asking for a favor. I was dictating the terms of surrender. A slow, grim smile spread across Arthur's weathered face. Thursday evening, he agreed. We will be there. Get your affairs in order, Michael. When the hammer drops, the blast radius is going to be massive. Before the federal hammer could drop, I needed to protect myself from the inevitable blast radius. Olivia and Vance were about to be hit with massive asset freezes and federal indictments. The government would seize every single bank account tied to their names, including all joint marital accounts. If I did not act immediately, I would be left completely penniless, locked out of my own money while the lawyers spent years fighting over the scraps. On Monday morning, while Olivia was at the office preparing for her massive gala, I went to our primary bank in downtown Dallas. I did not go to the teller window. I walked straight into the branch manager's office. I had spent the last 5 years quietly managing the back-end cybersecurity for this specific banking network as a favor to the branch manager. He owed me. I sat down in his office and systematically dismantled my financial connection to my wife. I closed every single joint credit card. I removed my name from the massive mortgage on the estate. Then I initiated a wire transfer. Over the last 10 years before I retired, I had saved a significant amount of clean, heavily taxed money from my federal salary and consulting fees. It was my money. Olivia had always mocked it as my little piggy bank. I moved every single cent of my clean money out of the joint accounts and transferred it into a newly created, highly secure individual trust account completely insulated from the marital estate. I instituted a strict legal firewall. I left exactly enough money in the joint checking account to cover the electric bill for the month. Nothing more. But I did not want Olivia to panic too early. If she checked the banking app and saw the empty accounts, she would immediately know something was wrong and might try to destroy evidence or flee the country. So I used my unique skill set. I logged into the back end of the bank's mobile application server. I wrote a tiny, completely invisible delay script. For the next 4 days, whenever Olivia opened her banking app on her phone, the server would feed her a cached, fake snapshot of her account balances. It would look exactly like her millions were still sitting safely in the vault. She would see a mirage. Next, I visited the top divorce attorney in the city, a ruthless, highly expensive shark who specialized in high-asset divorces involving criminal liability. I handed him a large retainer fee paid from my clean funds. I handed him a summary of the impending federal indictments. I told him to draft the absolute most aggressive divorce petition legally possible. I wanted a complete severance. I wanted an ironclad liability waiver proving I had no knowledge of her financial crimes. The lawyer looked over the documents, his eyes widening as he read the numbers. He looked up at me and smiled like a predator smelling blood in the water. Consider it done. I will have the papers ready to serve by Thursday night. I walked out of the law office and stepped into the bright Texas sunlight. I felt lighter. The heavy chains of my marriage had been cut. My assets were completely secured. The trap was set, the exits were locked, and there was absolutely nothing left to do but wait for the execution. The days leading up to the gala were surreal. I returned to the massive estate and played my role flawlessly. I was the quiet, obedient, slightly depressed husband. I fixed the jammed printer in the home office. I made sure the high-speed internet was running perfectly. I sat silently at the kitchen island drinking coffee while Vance paced back and forth, loudly rehearsing his arrogant keynote speech about corporate integrity and the future of ethical investing. Olivia was in a state of absolute frantic ecstasy. The charity gala was the crown jewel of her social calendar. She spent hours barking orders at her personal assistant over the phone, complaining about the floral arrangements and the catering menu. She completely ignored me, treating me as if I were a slightly annoying piece of furniture that she had to occasionally step around. On Thursday afternoon, just hours before the event, I was sitting in the living room reading a book. Olivia walked in holding a heavy garment bag. She tossed it carelessly onto the leather armchair across from me. "That is your suit for tonight," she said, checking her reflection in the large mirror above the fireplace. "It is a new tuxedo. I had the tailor hem the pants. Please, for the love of God, take a long shower and make sure your hair is combed properly. The governor is going to be sitting at our table, and the local news stations are sending camera crews. I do not want you looking like a homeless computer repairman in the background of my photographs." I slowly closed my book and looked at the garment bag. "I will make sure I look presentable, Olivia." "See that you do," she snapped, adjusting her expensive diamond necklace. "And listen to me carefully, Michael. Tonight is entirely about Vance and his new promotion. It is about the absolute success of this family. I want you to stay quiet. Do not try to make any stupid jokes. Do not talk to the board members about your boring little computer servers. In fact, try not to speak unless someone speaks to you first. Just stand there, hold a glass of champagne, and try to look like you actually belong in a room with successful people." I looked at her. I looked at the sheer arrogance radiating from her posture. She was standing at the absolute peak of her mountain of lies, completely unaware that the entire mountain was rigged with federal explosives. She truly believed she was untouchable. She believed her wealth made her a god. "I understand completely," I said softly. "I promise you, Olivia, I will not do anything to ruin your special night. Everyone is going to get exactly what they deserve." She rolled her eyes, missing the heavy implication entirely. "Good. The town car will be here in 1 hour. Do not be late." She walked out of the room. I stood up and walked over to the garment bag. I unzipped it and looked at the expensive, tailored tuxedo she had bought for me. It was beautiful. It was the perfect outfit for an execution. I smiled. A cold, genuine smile that did not reach my eyes. I took the suit and walked upstairs to get ready for the end of the world. The downtown convention center was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all sweeping glass and polished steel. The grand ballroom had been completely transformed for the firm's annual charity gala. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring ceiling, casting a warm, golden light over the room. Tables draped in heavy white silk were meticulously arranged around a massive central stage. The air was thick with the scent of expensive imported flowers, roasted filet mignon, and the subtle perfume of immense wealth. It was a theater of absolute hypocrisy. Nearly 400 people filled the room. The absolute elite of the city. Politicians, real estate tycoons, local celebrities, and every single major investor in the family fund. They stood around sipping vintage champagne, laughing loudly, and congratulating each other on how brilliant and successful they all were. Olivia was in her absolute element. She glided through the massive crowd in a stunning, glittering silver gown, shaking hands, kissing cheeks, and accepting endless compliments. She looked like a queen surveying her loyal subjects. Vance was standing near the front of the stage, surrounded by a tight circle of wealthy, older board members. He was holding a glass of scotch, laughing loudly, completely drunk on his own perceived power. I stood exactly where I was told to stand. I stood quietly near the edge of the room, near a large ice sculpture, holding a glass of sparkling water. I was wearing the perfectly tailored tuxedo. I watched the entire room with the cold, detached observation of a sniper looking through a scope. Several people walked past me without even acknowledging my existence. A few of Olivia's friends offered tight, pitying smiles before quickly turning away to talk to someone more important. I did not mind the isolation. I embraced it. At exactly 8 o'clock, the heavy ballroom doors were closed, and the massive crowd was asked to take their seats. The lights dimmed slowly, and a dramatic spotlight hit the center of the large stage. Olivia walked up to the podium. The crowd erupted into loud, enthusiastic applause. She smiled radiantly, holding her hands up gracefully to quiet the room. "Welcome," Olivia said, her voice echoing perfectly through the expensive sound system. Welcome to the absolute pinnacle of our firm's journey. Tonight is not just about celebrating our massive financial success. It is about celebrating integrity. It is about celebrating the unwavering trust our incredible clients place in us every single day. I took a slow sip of my water. The sheer audacity of her words was staggering. She was standing in front of the very people whose family legacies she had ruthlessly drained, lecturing them about trust. And nobody, Olivia continued, gesturing dramatically toward the front table, represents that absolute integrity better than my brother, our new managing director. Please, give a warm welcome to Vance. The room exploded into applause again as Vance practically jogged up the steps to the stage. He hugged Olivia, took the microphone, and flashed his arrogant, million-dollar smile at the crowd. He launched into a heavily rehearsed speech about corporate transparency, ethical leadership, and his grand, brilliant vision for the future of the family fund. I checked my watch. It was 8:15, right on schedule. Vance was right in the middle of a grand, sweeping sentence about the importance of protecting client assets when the heavy oak doors at the back of the massive ballroom were suddenly and violently pushed open. The loud bang of the heavy doors hitting the wall echoed like a gunshot through the silent, listening room. Vance froze mid-sentence, his mouth hanging slightly open. The spotlight remained fixed on him, but the attention of all 400 wealthy guests immediately snapped toward the back of the room. A murmur of intense confusion rippled through the sea of tables. Arthur walked into the ballroom. He was not wearing a tuxedo. He was wearing his dark federal trench coat over a sharp suit. His face was entirely devoid of emotion, and he was not alone. Pouring through the doors directly behind Arthur were 12 federal agents. They were wearing dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation printed boldly across their backs. They moved with terrifying, practiced precision, for agents immediately broke off and physically blocked all the emergency exits. 2 agents stepped to the side of the main doors, establishing a perimeter. The remaining 6 agents formed a tight wedge behind Arthur as he began a slow, deliberate march straight down the center aisle toward the stage. The murmurs in the crowd instantly died. The silence that fell over the massive ballroom was absolute and suffocating. You could hear the faint clinking of ice in glasses as hands began to shake. The wealthy and powerful do not like the police, but they are absolutely terrified of the federal government. Olivia, still standing near the edge of the stage, gripped the podium so hard her knuckles turned completely white. Her radiant smile had completely vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. Vance took a clumsy step backward, bumping into the microphone stand. Arthur stopped exactly 10 feet from the front of the stage. He looked up at Vance. He did not use a microphone, but his voice carried the heavy, unmistakable weight of absolute authority. "Vance," Arthur said calmly, "step away from the podium." Vance swallowed hard. His arrogant bravado completely collapsed. He looked like a terrified child. "What is the meaning of this? Do you have any idea who I am? We are in the middle of a private corporate event." Arthur pulled a folded piece of heavy paper from his coat pocket. "I am perfectly aware of who you are. I am executing a federal warrant for your immediate arrest. You are being charged with 72 counts of federal wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and the systemic laundering of $50 million in stolen client inheritance funds." The entire ballroom gasped. Several board members at the front table actually stood up in shock. "This is completely insane," Vance shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He looked desperately at Olivia. Tell them this is a huge mistake." Arthur ignored him. He looked directly at Olivia. "You are also under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and tampering with federal evidence. Agents, secure the suspects." 2 federal agents moved swiftly up the stairs to the stage, pulling handcuffs from their belts. That is when Olivia's survival instinct kicked in. The brilliant, sophisticated CEO completely vanished, replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. As the federal agents reached the top of the stairs, Olivia completely lost her mind. She threw her hands up and physically backed away from her brother, her eyes darting wildly around the massive ballroom. She grabbed the microphone from the stand, her hand trembling violently. She was executing a classic, desperate Darvo maneuver. Deny, attack, and reverse victim and offender. "Wait! Stop!" Olivia screamed into the microphone, the sound feeding back with a loud, piercing screech. "You have the wrong people. We did not do anything. We are the victims here." Arthur held up a hand, signaling the agents to pause for a second. "Is that so?" he asked calmly. Olivia pointed a trembling, manic finger directly across the ballroom. She pointed straight at me, standing quietly in the shadows near the ice sculpture. "It is him!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "My husband, Michael. He is a computer hacker. He runs all of our corporate IT systems. He has complete, unrestricted access to the servers. He has been incredibly jealous of my massive success for years. He framed us. He moved that money to ruin our family." The entire room turned to look at me. 400 pairs of eyes shifted from the screaming woman on the stage to the quiet husband standing in the corner holding a glass of water. A murmur of shock and sudden realization swept through the crowd. The board members nodded to each other, whispering. Of course, it made perfect sense to them. The lazy, useless husband had finally snapped and stolen the money out of pure spite. Vance, desperate for any lifeline, immediately grabbed onto the lie. "Yes," he yelled, pointing at me as well. "He handles all the cybersecurity. He told me the routing numbers were completely legitimate. He tricked me. I am innocent." Olivia burst into dramatic, hysterical tears. She collapsed against the heavy wooden podium, sobbing loudly into the microphone. "He manipulated us. He used my absolute trust to destroy my family. Please, arrest him. He is the one you want." It was a masterful, Oscar-worthy performance. If I had been an ordinary man, if I had been the weak, useless parasite she truly believed I was, her lie would have worked perfectly. The crowd would have believed her. The board would have backed her. I would have been dragged out of that ballroom in handcuffs, protesting my innocence to a world that had already convicted me. But I was not an ordinary man. I did not panic. I did not yell back. I did not try to passionately defend myself. Emotion is the enemy of truth. Data is the only thing that matters. I set my glass of sparkling water down on a nearby table. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored tuxedo. I stepped out of the shadows and began walking slowly, deliberately down the center aisle toward the main stage. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. Nobody said a word. I walked past Arthur, who gave me a slight, imperceptible nod. I walked up the short flight of stairs and stood directly in front of my screaming, sobbing wife. "Michael, how could you do this to me?" she wailed, leaning away from me as if I were a monster. I did not even look at her. I walked past her and approached the massive audiovisual control desk situated on the side of the stage. The frightened technician sitting there scrambled out of his chair and backed away. I reached into the inner pocket of my tuxedo jacket and pulled out a small, heavy metal flash drive. I plugged the metal flash drive directly into the master control console. My fingers moved rapidly across the technician's keyboard, bypassing the standard presentation software and taking absolute control of the ballroom's massive audiovisual system. "I am not going to argue with you, Olivia," I said clearly, leaning into the technician's microphone. My voice boomed smoothly through the room, cutting through her hysterical sobbing. "I am just going to show everyone the truth." I hit the enter key. The massive, 30-foot LED screen suspended behind the stage instantly flashed to life. The firm's corporate logo disappeared, replaced by a stark, high-resolution document. It was a bank routing ledger. "What is he doing? Turn that off!" Vance screamed, lunging toward the control desk. A federal agent immediately stepped in front of him, placing a heavy hand on Vance's chest and shoving him roughly back to the center of the stage. I spoke calmly into the microphone. my voice completely devoid of emotion. Behind me is the master ledger for the Cyprus offshore accounts. You will notice the digital authorization signature. It is mine. But I tapped a key, and the screen zoomed in closely on a specific line of code. If you look at the biometric terminal log, you will see that the signature was forcefully applied from the specific IP address located in Vance's private home office, while I was physically sitting in a federal secure facility. The room was dead silent. The board members were staring at the screen, their eyes wide with shock as they realized they were looking at hard, undeniable proof of massive federal crimes. I tapped another key. The screen shifted. It brought up the fake loss reports used to cover up the theft from the inheritance accounts. These are the fabricated loss reports. They are completely fraudulent. And at the bottom of each page is the authorizing electronic signature of your brilliant chief executive officer, Olivia. Olivia stopped crying immediately, her face drained of all color. She stared up at the massive screen in absolute, paralyzing horror. The lie was completely dead. There was no hiding from the data. But that is just financial data, I continued, my voice echoing like a judge reading a final sentence. Defense attorneys can argue about data. So, let us look at intent. I hit the final key. The massive LED screen filled with the email chain I had recovered from the deleted servers. I blew the text up so large that even the people sitting at the very back of the ballroom could read every single word perfectly. I read Olivia's own words out loud, slowly and deliberately. If the feds come knocking, they will see an isolated cyber breach. They will think he is a rogue hacker who got greedy. If it all goes to hell, that idiot takes the fall, not us. I stepped away from the control console and walked back to the center of the stage. I looked out at the massive crowd of wealthy elites. They were completely stunned. Some were covering their mouths in shock. Others were glaring at Olivia and Vance with absolute disgust. I turned slowly and finally looked directly at my wife. She was shaking violently. Her beautiful silver dress suddenly looked like a cheap costume. The arrogance, the superiority, the narcissism. It was all completely gone, replaced by the crushing, terrifying weight of reality. I did not frame you, Olivia, I said softly, but the microphone caught every word. I just backed up the data, because data never lies. Vance completely snapped. The realization that his entire life of absolute luxury was over, that he was going to spend decades in a federal prison, broke whatever fragile sanity he had left. You bastard! Vance screamed, his face turning an ugly shade of purple. He lunged wildly across the stage, throwing a clumsy, desperate punch aimed directly at my head. I did not even have to raise my hands. The federal agents moved with lightning speed. 2 agents grabbed Vance by his expensive suit jacket, spun him around violently, and slammed him face first onto the polished wooden floor of the stage. The heavy thud echoed through the room. Vance gasped for air as an agent planted a knee firmly between his shoulder blades and aggressively ratcheted thick metal handcuffs onto his wrists. Vance! Olivia shrieked, dropping to her knees. An agent stepped in front of her. Ma'am, put your hands behind your back. Do it now. Olivia looked up at the federal agent, then looked desperately at me. Tears were streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. The grand facade was entirely destroyed. Michael, please, she begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. Please do not do this. I am your wife. We took vows. You promised to protect me. I love you, Michael. Please, tell them to stop. I looked down at the woman kneeling on the floor. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no lingering affection. Just an overwhelming sense of profound emptiness. She was finally trying to use the love she had spent the last 5 years destroying to save herself from the consequences of her own actions. I leaned down slightly, getting close enough so only she could hear me. I loved you, I said quietly. I gave up my entire life to build a fortress to keep you safe. And you used that fortress to try and bury me alive. You wanted me to be the idiot who takes the fall. I straightened up and adjusted my tie. I looked her dead in the eyes. "I told you, Olivia," I said, my voice completely cold. "Tracing $50 million is significantly easier than fixing your Wi-Fi." I turned my back on her and walked away. I walked down the stairs of the stage and headed straight up the center aisle of the ballroom. I did not look back when the federal agents pulled her roughly to her feet and clamped the heavy metal handcuffs around her wrists. I did not stop walking when she started screaming my name, her voice echoing frantically through the silent crowd of stunned investors. I walked past the shocked board members. I walked past the local politicians. I walked straight out the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom, out of the convention center, and into the cool, quiet Texas night air. Behind me, the empire of lies was completely burning to the ground. The absolute destruction of the family fund was swift, brutal, and incredibly public. The local media had a complete field day. By the following morning, Olivia and Vance's faces were plastered across every single news channel and newspaper in the state. The scandal rocked the financial world. The legal fallout was exactly as Arthur had predicted. The federal prosecutors offered absolutely no mercy. Confronted with the 500-page dossier of irrefutable, mathematically verified digital evidence, Vance's expensive defense attorneys realized they had absolutely no case. There was no plea deal offered. Vance was found guilty on all 72 counts. He was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, with absolutely no possibility of early parole. The arrogant man who could not be bothered to fix a printer was going to spend the rest of his youth wearing a cheap orange jumpsuit. Olivia fought the charges, desperately trying to spin a narrative that she was completely unaware of her brother's actions. But the recovered emails destroyed her defense completely. She avoided a massive prison sentence by completely liquidating every single asset she owned to pay massive restitution to the defrauded clients. But the judge still handed her a brutal 5-year sentence in a minimum security facility for conspiracy and tampering with evidence. The federal government seized the sprawling estate in the hills. They seized the obnoxious sports cars, the massive wine collection, and the expensive designer jewelry. The investment firm filed for immediate, catastrophic bankruptcy. Olivia was left with absolutely nothing. Her wealth, her status, and her precious family legacy were completely wiped off the face of the earth. As for me, my ruthless divorce attorney delivered exactly what he promised. Because I had preemptively separated my clean finances and secured the ironclad liability waiver proving my complete innocence in the fraud, my individual trust account remained entirely untouched by the massive federal asset freezes. The divorce was finalized rapidly. Olivia, sitting in a Stark holding cell awaiting transfer to federal prison, was forced to sign the final papers with a cheap plastic pen. She tried to demand a portion of my savings, claiming it was marital property. The judge literally laughed her expensive lawyer out of the courtroom. I was completely free. The heavy, suffocating chain that had been dragging me down into the dark for the last 10 years had finally been shattered into a million pieces. 6 months after the charity gala, the massive scandal had finally faded from the daily news cycle, replaced by whatever new crisis the world had invented. I was no longer living in Dallas. I had quietly packed my bags, left the chaos behind, and moved into a beautiful, quiet, high-rise apartment overlooking the ocean in Miami. I was sitting on my private balcony on a bright Tuesday morning. The warm, salty breeze was blowing in off the water. The sky was an impossible, endless shade of blue, completely unbothered by a single cloud. I was drinking a cup of strong, black coffee. It was the best cup of coffee I had ever tasted in my entire life, simply because I had brewed it myself in my own quiet kitchen, with absolutely nobody there to tell me I was doing it wrong. My laptop was open on the small glass table next to me. I was not tracing stolen inheritance funds. I was not analyzing complex offshore corporate shell companies. I was reviewing a massive cybersecurity contract. After the trial, Arthur had officially requested that I return to the bureau as a senior independent consultant. I was back in the game, doing exactly what I was born to do on my own strict terms. I was no longer a ghost haunting the basement of a massive mansion. I was a weapon, sharp and fully loaded. I set my coffee cup down, I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small object. It was my heavy gold wedding ring. I had kept it for the last 6 months, not out of any lingering sentimentality, but as a physical reminder. A reminder of how incredibly easy it is to lose yourself when you stop demanding the respect you absolutely deserve. I looked at the gold band catching the bright morning sunlight. I thought about Olivia sitting in a federal cell, stripped of all her arrogant power. I thought about Vance spending the next 15 years locked in a cage because he thought he was smarter than the data. They had built their entire lives on the arrogant belief that they could simply use people and throw them away without any consequences. They were wrong. The best revenge in the world is not loud. It is not screaming matches in the middle of a kitchen. It is not throwing broken objects against a wall. The best revenge is absolute, irrefutable truth. It is refusing to compromise your own profound value just to make someone else feel comfortable. It is calmly, methodically removing yourself from the toxic equation and letting their own massive lies crush them under the weight of reality. I stood up, walked to the absolute edge of the glass balcony, and looked down at the deep blue water crashing against the rocks far below. I held the gold ring over the edge. I opened my hand. I watched it fall, a tiny speck of gold disappearing forever into the vast, unforgiving ocean. I turned my back to the water, walked inside my quiet, peaceful apartment, and got back to work. I was finally truly free.